Let's rise for our prayer. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Tyrant Martyrs,
Pray for us.
Saint Thomas Aquinas,
Pray for us.
Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen. Today, in chapter 2 of the Flippin' Packet, part 3 or part 4, distinctions in the intellect. All right, so as we have previously kind of gone through, made distinctions between the vegetative powers, there's 3 different kinds, made distinction among the sensitive powers. There's 9 senses in total with appetites as well. We're now going to go through the rational powers. We're really just going to be going through the intellect itself. We won't be doing all the powers because the will would be included in the rational powers, but we're excluding that today. So we're looking just distinctly at the intellect itself. And the powers of the intellect are twofold. First is the agent intellect. It's called the agent or active intellect because it is always an act. All right, it is never shut off, so to speak. Always running constantly like a motor. And what it's constantly doing in act is presenting the content of the interior senses to the potential intellect. The potential intellect is the second power. That's the power that does the actual understanding of what's being presented to it. We're good at here? Some additional notes on the agent intellect. Some Christian philosophers believed the agent intellect was supplied completely by God. It's a little complex, but from what I can go based off of memory, they're kind of more in line of like the you call them like neo-Christian Platonists. So if you remember Plato, his idea of the human intellect was that it grasped the immaterial, eternal forms. And so these Christian philosophers kind of baptized that Platonic idea. Instead of having a world of forms, the forms that were unchanging, eternal, what have you, were actually divine ideas. Right? They're the God's idea of the idea of equality and so on and so forth. And that when humans came to that level of knowledge of the universal and unchanging, it was actually participating in the divine intellect. And God was the one actually enlightening the intellect by sharing the divine idea with man. It's kind of similar to how we also explain how angels come to knowledge. Thomas rejects this notion, though. Because he does not, he does not believe this does justice to God's wisdom. Essentially, the point is that, you find it kind of, Thomas sees it as an insult to God's wisdom, as if God had made a creature that wasn't complete in its own nature, right? Since it's part of human nature to know material things, to have a material soul, Thomas would find it strange that God would create a creature like that and then not equip it, to actually perform its functions that it's been designed to do. So just as to God's wisdom. Essentially, his position is God would not make a creature incapable of executing its nature. If you think about it, and everything we talked about, what separates man from animals, for Thomas, this would mean that unless God was giving man a directly infused insight into the divine ideas, then there's nothing. Then man would just simply be, equal to brutes, to animals, being limited on the level of sense knowledge, right? And so you kind of like lessen the dignity of human nature as it stands apart from brutes, if there's that constant, relying on God to have any kind of immaterial knowledge, because also free will follows from that as well, as we'll see later when we get to the free will. All right, so we're now going to move on to the potential intellect. This is the second power of the intellect. It's called potential because it's in potency to receive all knowledge. The human intellect for Thomas is a blank slate when it's created. Okay? There's absolutely nothing on there. And it's by going through life and experiencing things, forming phantasms, the intellect constantly picking up on these phantasms and presenting to the potential intellect, that you really start to develop, this power. Okay, it's so it's potential because it's always open to receiving more and more. The potential intellect, even though it's called potential, it does have three functions, right? There's three activities that the potential intellect can perform, which can be confusing to keep it straight, because you typically think of potency as doing nothing but receiving, potency not being a principle of act. But it does do three actions, and they are the following. The first simple action of the potential intellect is the action of apprehension. Apprehension is the perceiving a thing or essence. When you read the Summa, Thomas refers to essence as quiddity. That's just a Latin term for means whatness. Another way of saying essence. Okay, so I'll say that the apprehension is perceiving a thing's quiddity, its essence. What makes it be that particular entity? So a couple different examples of this would be greenness. Just simply apprehending what it means to be green, or what green is. Apprehending man. Just the concept on its own. Or another example would be goodness, or equality. Just simply knowing those things is the first act of the potential intellect. The second act of the potential intellect is judgment. Any questions so far up to this point? Okay. Judgment is, as an act, composes and divides concepts. It puts concepts together, identifies them as the same, or separates concepts and identifies them as not being the same. So a couple examples of how we express the intellect's act of judgment would be a complete sentence. So the ladder is green. All right, in that act of judgment, the intellect is uniting two concepts, namely ladder and greenness. Those two concepts come together. And says, yep, these go together. Another way of expressing, composing, and dividing is belief. So the judgment of the potential intellect is what's responsible for beliefs. So I believe in one God. What you're doing here is the same thing as composing and dividing a concept, but what's being composed in a belief? What two concepts is your intellect conjoining together?
Existing and not being able to prove that it exists.
Existing and not being able to prove that it exists.
You make sure
Not quite necessarily. But I'm interested that you said existence. Something like that. Maybe. Not how I'd express it though. But you might be onto something there. Any other ideas? The composition is statement. All right. Say God, and then, or one God, and then veracity, truth. All right. So think of like the concept of that something is true or false, and then a statement, and then you're combining those two concepts together and say, yep, one God, that is true. So it's it's basically the same act of judgment that's being done, okay? But we talk about it in different ways. It's different to say what you're composing is different content, right? Namely veracity. Belief is not simply restricted to religious principles. And this is something that I think is an important distinction to make because people will get confused with this. So you might also hold the belief that, does anyone know what their family's having for dinner tonight? This is relevant to the class.
I think we're having a roast.
You're having a roast.
Yeah.
Will you have the roast?
Yeah.
Okay, that's an active belief. Mother will cook a roast. That is also an active belief. It's not verifiable. But what you're doing is your intellect is combining roast for dinner tonight, promised by mother, attaching veracity. True. Okay, yeah. That's something I'll believe in. All right. Or you walk in and you said, I had so much fun in gym class. I'll either just add veracity in my intellect to that statement or not. Okay. So the human intellect constantly acts on belief all the time. You can't really live without this functioning of the intellect. Society would completely fall apart. All right. The final power of or function of the potential intellect is what's commonly referred to as reason. Reason is a series of judgments that brings us to new knowledge. So an example of the reasoning process that can bring someone to new knowledge can be spoken verbally through a syllogism, or what's in other words, an argument. So, for example, people have rights. A fetus is a person. All right, those are two judgments that have been made. I've united the concept of personhood and associate with rights. And then I've made another judgment. I've united the concept of what a fetus is and conjoin and say, yep, that's the same thing as a person. And then what's the new knowledge that would be arrived at through the reasoning process?
Fetus has rights.
Yeah, a fetus has rights is then the conclusion. Ergo. And this is where what the science of logic studies. Okay, it studies the rules by which the intellect reasons. So this reasoning power can recognize, lead you to new knowledge, and it can also recognize something as not being the case because it can detect errors when rules of reasoning are not followed. And it's like we're hardwired, our intellect is hardwired to follow these rules. So to speak. So an example of something that would be no bueno that we could automatically perceive as not being correct. No roses are red. No violets are blue. Or let's try to not be super irrational here. Maybe we could. That might be fun. I think. No roses are blue. Okay, here. No roses have color. All right, so this type of an argument, no roses are red, no roses are blue, therefore no roses have color. That's a violation of logic. Your intellect can look at that and say, no, this actually doesn't follow. You're hardwired in your nature to recognize this. All right, it's the power of reason, just like you're hardwired in your nature to like see things. All right, it's as regular as that. The issue is that you can't have a conclusion come from two negative premises, and that's the fault that lies here. And so the science of logic studies the operations of the reasoning and kind of formulates things into rules for people to follow and understand with clarity. All right, so continuing on reason. Reason can either be speculative or practical. Speculative reasoning occurs when you reason about something or you seek to know something simply for its own sake. All right, and an example of speculative reasoning would be philosophy, most philosophy. Well, so let's get more specific. How about metaphysics? Literature. All right, there's nothing super practical about reading Jane Austen, right? But it's something that can be pursued for its own sake. Mathematics, most of the time it's speculative. It's like you just learn these equations for the sake of knowing the equations. And that's why most people don't like it. Studying philosophy, most philosophy like a human nature course. Right? This is simply speculative. Why are you studying this? Because it's just good to know these things. The speculative is contrasted with the practical. So a practical reasoning is when you know something because it is useful. And some examples of this would be knowing how to drive a car, studying medicine, plumbing. All right, you don't study those things just because it's for the sake of the knowledge itself. Right? You study it because there's some end in mind that's practical. Now, sometimes things can cross over. So someone might really get into plumbing and think like, wow, I love studying the engineering behind this just because that's my hobby. In that case, well, that's speculative reason that's operating. You're knowing something just for the sake of knowing it. And then another speculative science, like say human nature, you might incorporate into psychology, right? And that end then it takes on a practical end when you're studying human nature for the sake of exercising some function or role. Which type of reasoning do you guys think is higher, according to the philosophers?
According to the philosophers, probably the speculative.
Probably speculative, right? Because that's what they're doing. Yeah. No. So yeah, the speculative is what's higher because when you study plumbing, it's good. Practical stuff is good, but you're not studying it for its own sake. You're studying it so that you can stop a leaky faucet. In a way, you value a well-functioning faucet over the knowledge surrounding plumbing. All right, you value transportation over the knowledge of driving a car. Because if there's another more efficient way, you readily ditch the knowledge of driving a car and pursue something else. The speculative knowledge is hard because it's good in and of itself. All right, it is the good that is pursued. right? And man in his nature desires to know. And it's what completes, human nature ultimately is going to be a kind of speculative reasoning, a kind of speculative knowledge where, when philosophers, theologians talk about the beatific vision, that is just having knowledge and resting that knowledge on the divine essence, and that's the end itself. Okay? And so ultimately within human nature, the speculative reasoning is higher, but it's not the downcast, practical reasoning. It's the same intellect that does both, right? The only distinction is what is the end? What's the purpose? What's the goal? All right, any questions? All right, we're done for today. Read chapter 3 for homework. More questions on that tomorrow.